Good morning and good afternoon to our attendee today. My name is Kellyanne McHugh, and I have the pleasure of welcoming Kroll today to our webinar on market sounding compliance, missing the right regulatory notes. And this webinar is in preparation for the upcoming go live of the market sounding guidelines that are being launched by Hong Kong Securities and Futures Commission. These came out last year, but are going live in May this year, so we're preparing for that. So, as I mentioned, my name is Kellyanne McHugh, and I am the APAC Director for my compliance office. We're a global leading compliance management software provider, headquartered out of Dublin, Ireland. But our HQ in APAC is here in Singapore, and we're really excited to be joined today by our friends at Kroll Compliance Consulting. Pranavi, do you mind introducing yourself first?
Yeah. Thank you. Hi, everyone. I co-lead the US practice for APAC at Kroll, where we service clients who are registered with the SEC, NFA, and CFTC as registered investment advisors, ERAs, CPOs, and CTAs. But I work with a lot of clients who are registered with two or more regulators. So, of course, SFC, as you see, is our broadest range of clients. And then we have MAS as well. It's a pleasure to speak to you today.
And Laura?
Thanks, Kellyanne. Morning, everybody. I'm Laura Graham. I'm a director in Kroll's Financial Services Compliance Regulation Practice Group with Pranavi. So as Pranavi mentioned, we cover a range of clients who are licensed in Hong Kong with the SFC, as well as the MAS and with US registrations as well. I've been in regulatory practice for over a decade in Hong Kong and been at Kroll for a few months now.
Well, thank you both for joining us today and sharing a little bit about your experience. And we're really grateful that you can share some insight around this regulation, both its impact locally in Hong Kong, regionally, and globally. In preparation for this webinar, we did ask a registration question: what is your greatest challenge with market sounding activities? And the resounding challenge, it seems, for most people is keeping up with regulatory changes still. I've been looking after regulatory content and regulatory change management also for a large number of years now. And this still is an ongoing challenge. 45% of you said that keeping up with changes and what this means and how it impacts you is challenging. 24% of you want to understand from this webinar the difference between the buy side and the sell side responsibility with this regulation, and we will go through that today as well. 18% of you want to know, what is material non-public information versus the market sounding information that is being discussed within the SFC regulation. And we'll discuss that again today. What are the differences between MAR versus market sounding, and whether we have full clarity on that today. And also, there's a smaller number of interests around technology on how to report and your record keeping around market sounding activity, human resources, as well as managing staff, training, and documentation. So without further delay, I'd like to pass over to Pranavi and Laura to dive into the content. Over to you.
Thanks, Kellyanne. Okay, so we'll start out. It's actually fitting that many people are wanting to understand sort of what the definition of market sounding is and what it means when SFC says that for their guidelines. So, market sounding is a really incredibly useful tool for the market. It's a way for sell-side participants mostly, or issuers, to sort of gauge an understanding of market appetite for different transactions that they may want to enter into. So we typically think of these sort of private placements or block trades. SFC specifically in the guidelines sets forth that these are what they're encompassing are communication of information to potential investors prior to the announcement of any potential transaction to gauge interest in a possible transaction, and in doing so, determining sort of specifications around that transaction. So potential timing, the size of the transaction, pricing, and then trading methods that would be undertaken. It's a really powerful tool for the market, but it also poses significant risk given that if they're not managed properly, if market sounding information is not managed properly, it can lead to unlawful disclosure of inside information, potential market manipulation, and other regulatory concerns. So the SFC's guidelines are really guided by three general principles that they pulled out from the Code of Conduct, as well as the Fund Manager Code of Conduct. And what they're looking at here are the principles are looking at honesty and fairness. They want to make, that this is a key principle in the guidelines that they are issuing. They're also looking at diligence and making sure that licensed representatives are acting with due skill, care, diligence in transactions. And finally, conflicts of interest from the COC. The FMCC also speaks about functional separation. So where there's a fund manager who may be engaged in different kinds of financial activities for corporate finance, banking, or broker, they want to make sure that there should be an effective system in place of functional barriers to prevent the flow of information. So those 4 principles are sort of the core of what SFC was thinking when they wanted to put together these guidelines for the market. Key here for the SFC, the definition of market sounding is that it's not limited to MNPI. It's broader than that. It's a broader definition, and it's not necessarily focused on information that is price sensitive. Rather, they look at where there's a duty of confidentiality that has been established around the information. The guidelines define market sounding with sort of having 4 limbs, 4 attributes, where the subject security has been named, or if not named specifically, there's enough specific information that would allow someone hearing the information to deduce what security or what issue is being discussed. The entity of the market sounding beneficiary has been made clear, and also the market sounding beneficiary's intent to pursue a possible transaction. So they're looking to actually to do something specific. And then also the terms around that potential transaction. So the sizing of it, again, the timing, the trading method, that kind of information would also be included in the market sounding definition from the SFC. The SFC did also issue an FAQ where they did go through provided some helpful guidelines around what they would not consider market sounding. They did provide some carve-outs. So like an actual order placement by a client and these sort of day-to-day transactions, day-to-day working orders are not considered in scope. And they're also not considering in scope generic discussions. So about, sort of public information that's already out there, or even market rumors that people are hearing. Those sorts of discussions, those sort of conversations would not be subject to these guidelines and not be considered market sounding information. But I think the key takeaway on this is that really it's much broader than sort of our traditional concept of MNPI and what we considered under wall crossing. I think firms are sort of well-versed in understanding what's material price sensitive, but it's a little bit more ambiguous in terms of what this new definition is for market sounding information. So I think that's one thing that we'll focus on today, and we'll talk about how we can implement that. Okay, so moving on, we'll look at some precedent for the SFC's approach and some global practices that have been adopted elsewhere. So certainly, the concept of having guidelines and rules around this practice of market sounding is not unique or novel to the SFC. To Hong Kong, the EU has had this in place under their market abuse regulation, the MAR, under Article 11 since 2016. So quite some time now. It's been adopted in the UK since 2020. The definition of market sounding of the MAR regime is quite similar to what SFC is looking at. It's the sharing of information with potential investors prior to an announcement of a transaction, again, to gauge potential interest. If market participants comply with the requirements under the MAR regime, which we'll discuss, then essentially it provides that disclosing party with a sort of a safe harbor against the general prohibition on disclosing inside information. The MAR regime is quite specific in terms of what it requires, and so we'll go into that. So in terms of what market sounding is under the definition, it's as we said, sort of those communications with potential potential investors, and it has to be made by a certain party, either the issuer itself or a secondary offerer or a third party acting on behalf of one of those parties. But MAR also includes cases where there's someone who may be interested in making a takeover bid for securities or a merger of a company, and they disclose inside information in that context. But in that context, there's 2 very specific conditions that have to be met, and it's that the people who the information is necessary for those parties who are entitled to put their securities forward into offering. to make that decision, and also that the willingness of the parties to offer their securities into an offer is required to decide to go forward. So those are sort of the context, the lay of the land. The key here, and what's different from SFC's guidelines, is that the focus here is on inside information. They define inside information as being precise in nature. It has not been made public. It's related either directly or indirectly to an issuer or a specific financial instrument. And importantly, if that information were made public, it would likely have a significant effect on the price of that financial instrument. So this is, again, different from the SFC's approach, which is broader. It's not limited to this inside information concept. So in terms of what the MAR regime requires, similar to SFC guidelines that we'll go into, it sort of divides the world into two. It has the disclosing market participant and the market sounding recipient. And for each party, there are certain obligations imposed. Although similar to SFC, the bulk of these obligations really lie with the disclosing market participant. The market sounding rules apply to a broad range of financial instruments, regulated on the EU markets, but also includes those on multilateral trading facilities or organized trading facilities. So it's quite broad in its scope. And then in terms of carrying out the market sounding, so here we'll see some similarities and differences with the SFC. And I think once we go into the SFC specific requirements under their guidelines, you can certainly see where they have looked to other regions and been informed by other regions when thinking about how to develop their own rules. So the MAR regime has a pre-sounding procedure, and it requires the disclosing party. Firstly, they have to determine whether the information they're sharing is inside information. MAR regime is quite stringent on its record keeping and requirements. And so that assessment in terms of whether you are disclosing inside information is required to be recorded by the disclosing market participant, that assessment, and as well as the conclusion. If it is inside information, then there's obligation of the disclosing party to obtain a consent from the recipient. They have to inform the recipient on the prohibition of using that information, trading on that information, and also remind its recipient on its confidentiality obligations, but not to disclose that inside information. The obtaining express consent from the recipient party is quite important here, and this is similar to what SFC requires. And then the disclosing party has to retain a record of all of this information that was shared, who received it, the names of the parties, the time, and this has to be kept for 5 years. It also, importantly, it also requires the disclosing party to keep a list of those who did not want to receive the information. So if they did not obtain the consent, then they also have to record that, who said no. There's also a requirement on the recipient person to make their own assessment about whether they're receiving inside information. So not only does the disclosing party have to make that assessment and conclusion, but the recipient party also has to do the same thing, whether they think that by receiving this information, they're now in possession of inside information themselves. MAR regime also requires a standardized script when delivering this information, which is similar to what Hong Kong's decided to do. One thing that's slightly different, MAR regime does allow market sounding to be carried out on unrecorded channels. But if that's the case, if for some reason unrecorded channel is not available, it's allowed, but there's very stringent record keeping requirements around that. So the disclosing party, after providing that market sounding, has to create a record and notes of that market sounding, and then it has to be sent to the market recipient, signed by both parties within 5 days. So it's quite stringent, but it can be done. SFC is a little bit different on this, which we'll go into. For cleansing, the regime is quite clear that it's the disclosing party's responsibility to ensure that the market sounding recipient is notified when the information ceases to be inside information. The SFC does outline some FAQs on this, but it's not in a specific in the guidelines. And then there's also internal policy and procedure expectations that the MAR regime puts on both the disclosing and the recipient party. I mean, the bulk of these, as mentioned, the bulk of this is on the disclosing party to have in place, but there's certainly requirements on both sides. The procedures that disclosing parties should have in place are they should make sure that their instructions on the market sounding is very clear, and that they should be doing on a recorded line. And if not on a recorded line, then they have to comply with those record keeping requirements that I just mentioned. And that they always have to provide, a list of certain information that has to be done before the market sounding starts. So when contacting the person initially, that the recipient, they have to let them know market sounding is involved, notify them that they're on a recorded line and receive their consent for that, clarify, make sure that the person they're speaking to is entitled to receive that information. And then if they have available an estimation of how long they think that information will continue to be inside information, or when they think it will cease. Again, the recipient person is also required to have various procedures in place. And importantly, for their side is they should have staff training on handling the receipt of the inside information and market sounding information. And they're also required to maintain a list of people on their side who receive the information. So it's a very thorough regime that the EU has in place. It's been in place for quite a while now. And I think as we go through what Hong Kong is doing, you will see where there have been influences, where there have been slight deviations. But what's helpful is that given that this regime has been set up in the EU and the UK for some time now, it may help to inform firms on how to implement different controls into their practices in Hong Kong. So moving on, we'll go to the specific requirements Pranavi will cover for the SFC guidelines.
Yeah. So if you see from an SFC perspective, if you see the consultation to what the circular was, the SFC has come a very long way. When we speak specifically on the consultation that the SFC did have, there were important aspects that were not defined that led to a lot of confusion. The first one was price-sensitive inside information, and the market participants did think that there should be a distinction between non-public information and price-sensitive inside information. Specifically, if non-public information is retained as a relevant trigger for wall crossing under market sounding guidelines, then there should be clear guidelines on how that differentiates to non-public information as well. So that and in other proposed aspects of the guidelines. So that was an important aspect that was there in the consultation, which also led to the participants wanting to have differences between DCM and equity capital markets transactions. And a lot of the participants did think that arguably the industry did think that DCM should be scoped out. The SFC did go into, so SFC is doing a good job. It did go into the FAQs that said only DCM transactions, which are likely to materially affect the price of shares that are listed on an exchange, would be in scope. So that though they haven't made it black and white, but they have said, caveated it in a way that's saying only those DCM transactions would be in scope for the circular. And also there has been an attempt to carve out day-to-day transactions and giving more guidance on that, as well as there is more guidance on cleansing. So we will go into that when we speak about the circular. Let's get into the details and start from the top. So the guideline was gazetted on 1st of November 2024 and is going to come into effect on 2nd of May of this year. The industry is asking the SFC for more time. So the industry participants have asked at least for a 6-month extension. So let's see if that is going to be granted in any way. Market sounding in the circular now has a definition, as Laura has had discussed. So again, from the consultation to now, it has come a long way in terms of getting more specific definitions and guidelines of what the applicability. Though there are some gray areas, but at least it's in a better state than the consultation was. So what's really in scope? There's a two-pronged approach. Possible transactions in number one, shares that are listed on an exchange, and the second one is any other securities which is likely to materially affect the price of shares that are listed on an exchange. Now, language for this is very similar to in what they have in the FAQs for DCM. So just a reminder, only DCM transactions that are going to materially affect the price of shares on an exchange are going to be in scope for the guidelines. Now, there has been discussion between the buy side and the sell side about public blocks under specific fact patterns. Some are of the opinion that public blocks falls inside the scope, and some say that it is outside. the sell-side firms are thinking that depending on the type and size of the block and whether there is information advantage, the block, like if the block is discounted, they are going to see if this is going to be within the scope or not. So another gray area that the industry is speaking about. The some of the sell side participants are likely to take a principle based approach, some take a matrix based approach, but we will see once this does come into effect what this will look like. Another point is on actual order placement by a client, and that should be outside the scope of the circular if for the purpose of execution of client orders as per client instructions. There are some other conversations that would not be MSI, market sounding information. The first one is a generic discussion about public information, market trends, sentiments, as well as other anecdotal or unverified information. The second is trade ideas put forward by the sell side broker or reverse inquiries by the buy side firm without any indication from the market sounding beneficiary to engage potential investors or feedback on a possible transaction. So there are some examples that the SFC has given on what would not be market sounding. But again, these are pretty broad in their explanation as well. The SFC does have a preference that market sounding conversations happen outside of market hours, but we know from client feedback and from other industry participants as well that it is going to take, it mostly does take place within market hours. It's an obvious point, but just an important point that these guidelines are not just for Hong Kong listed issuers, but rather the scope is defined as market sounding activity that is conducted by intermediaries in Hong Kong. So that does broaden the scope to some extent as well. There are gray areas like we had discussed in specific scenarios. Like, for example, our clients have asked us what happens if two brokers take a different approach to market sounding. So, for example, they receive information from a broker who doesn't think that this information is MSI versus another broker who thinks this information is MSI and asks for consent, and then the buy side says no for it. Would they still be under the guideline because they have received it not under MSI from a different broker? So there are possible scenarios that will have to be seen on a case-by-case basis on the applicability of the circular. And another one is on it regards to offshore affiliates. So if there is a sell-side broker who is intermediating a transaction for an offshore affiliate and being delegated by the affiliate to share market sounding information with potential investors, however, the sell-side broker has no relationship with the market sounding beneficiary. So would they be scoped in or scoped out? So there are, of course, based on the guideline, there are different scenarios to which this might be applicable. And of course, more guidance from the SFC is required on these. The SFC has defined 4 core principles which are applicable to both the buy and the sell side. The first core principle is handling of information, which in my view is the important one. The second one is governance. The third one is policies and procedures. And the fourth one is review and monitoring controls. So specifically talking about the first one is speaking about handling of information. The spirit here is to ensure that there is no accidental disclosure or misuse of information within the firm. An important aspect of MSI that SFC has been speaking about is information barriers that are important. So even if you do receive MSI, you can still have legitimate trading activities as long as there are information barriers. And this is covered in the FAQ question 7 in terms of trading legitimate transactions when you do have MSI. Now, going into another aspect, which is cleansing. So SFC says you are cleansed if you no longer have a duty of confidentiality towards handling, safeguarding, or sharing the subject of the MSI. And generally speaking, it is when a possible transaction has either materialized or not materialized. The SFC's expectation that it covers in the FAQ is that the market sounding intermediaries are encouraged to have clear and transparent communication and also to be in constant communication. I think this is where the industry is asking for more clarity in terms of if you are not in constant communication, then is it a best practice or are you going to be in violation? So who does the cleansing responsibility finally rely on? Is it going to be on the buy side or sell side? So this is, again, a little bit ambiguous. But I think how the SFC wants it, that they want the spirit of the guideline to be followed and communication to be there from both sides. Moving on, we will go on into the specifics on what are the expectations from both parties. So let's go into the disclosing person first. There are 4 major things that are required from the sell side. The first is procedures before conducting market sounding. So, of course, having agreement or consent from the corresponding market sounding beneficiary. The second is determining in advance the standard of information that is going to be disclosed, an appropriate time for this to be disclosed, and the suitable number of recipients on a case-by-case basis. The second thing that the disclosing person should keep in mind is the use of authorized communication channels. So the SFC does expect the sell side to use communication channels that are authorized by senior management, and this does tie into record keeping. So you do have appropriate records and can send that to the regulators as and when it is expected. The third, which is very similar to the MAR as well, is standardized script. They do want to ensure that there is an opening statement on the communication or the purpose of market sounding and the confirmation that whoever is receiving this information from the buyer side is authorized to receive it. They also want a request for consent, that the conversation is being recorded and they do consent on receiving MSI. So those are important aspects of the script. And third are both are the record keeping requirements. So no less than 2 years, whereas it's 5 years under MAR. So that is another distinction that is there. Under record keeping, there are certain records that are needed to be kept on file. The first one is the consent that we spoke about of receiving MSI. The second is the list of recipients who do not wish to receive MSI, audio, video, or text recording on MSI that is conducted through a recorded channel, written minutes of market sounding conducted through unrecorded channel, which is an interesting one because the SFC in its expectations did say that disclosing person should only use authorized communication channels, and also a list of all internal and external persons who do receive market sounding with the details of their name and contact detail. So this is the record keeping requirements that the sell side should have. It is important to keep in mind that one of the things that the buy side is asking the sell side is if they have a common approach in distinguishing MSI to MNPI, and there is no one size fits all yet by the sell side, and each firm kind of taking a different approach. So we will wait for once this is implemented, how this does take place. When it comes to the person who is receiving, it is important that they do authorize a person who has adequate knowledge of the internal policies. The buy side is having proper communication that they wish to receive market sounding information, and reasonable efforts to ensure that the sell side who is giving the information is in possession with MSI. So that's where this scenario that we discussed earlier was coming in. Then how if 2 sell side brokers are taking different approaches to MSI, one is defining and one is not, then what is the buy side's obligation in terms of ensuring that that information is categorized under MSI? In conclusion of the circular and the requirements, it is a reminder that the guidelines are not intended to restrict market sounding in any way, but are putting more systems and controls in place so that it can happen in an orderly fashion.
Yeah, thank you, Pranavi. So we'll just also cover next sort of what we can do here, what we can do to prepare for this. And I think to Pranavi's point, it's not about restricting these conversations or these communications, but it's about having the right frameworks in place so that they are, the market abuse concepts that we think of in terms of trading on inside information, market manipulation are mitigated. At the core of the sort of how you can prepare in terms of when you're thinking of your framework, I think we should look back to those 4 core principles that Pranavi mentioned, that SFC frames the guidelines. So the governance, policies and procedures, review and monitoring controls, and the handling of information. So we can sort of go through these one by one. For governance, I think the guidelines have made it clear that it really is the SFC's expectation that senior management is really ultimately responsible for the oversight of this market sounding process and responsible for ensuring that all the risks associated with it that we've discussed are properly mitigated. There's, this is in keeping with the SFC's sort of thematic approach to governance in general these days. They really are placing a lot of emphasis on senior management to make sure that they are taking responsibility for internal control frameworks. As recently as this month, there have been a few enforcement actions against ROs, against MICs, where they've found that there was a failure by those people to properly manage internal control frameworks. So again, it's key to have senior management oversight of this process. One suggestion, again, this will, as Pranavi said, it's not a one-size-fits-all for every firm. It will certainly depend on the size and risk and nature of the firm in question. But one suggestion that the SFC guidelines made was that, governance may look like maybe designating a specialized committee that handles or oversees these market sounding process, which has reporting lines up to the senior management and the board. So that's one thing that firms can think of when they're looking to implement or uplift their framework. Policies and procedures. These should clearly set forth in a written document all the different responsibilities and obligations that Pranavi went through. So this will for the sell side, for the disclosing participant, it'll be important to make sure that these procedures are documented, with regard to the standardized script, receiving consent, the record keeping, all that should be written down and in a way that employees know how to follow it. There's also different, aside from like the specific procedures on the market sounding and how to conduct that and the framework around that, there's other things that you can think of here as well in terms of escalation protocols. So what happens if there's leak or misuse of information? Firm and staff personal trading policies may have to be tweaked a little bit to cover for these kinds of potential issues with market sounding that firms receiving. And then the identification and handling of the actual market sounding itself. So these are different aspects that probably are already, the broader concept is probably already in place in most compliance frameworks, but it may be a matter of taking a look at those, making sure that they cover for these specific nuances that come in with market sounding now that we have to make sure that there's these controls around that information in the firm. The handling of information was sort of touched on by Pranavi as well as being one of the key principles here. This was also, if you remember back to what the SFC outlined as what are the core sort of principles that were the pillars of this guideline or what they were thinking about when implementing this guideline. They did cite to that FMCC concept of the segregation of duties. So it will be important to make sure that there's the appropriate information barriers in place. But this is going to really, again, depend on the size of the firm and the operations. But key here is, making sure that the firm is identifying who will be responsible for receiving that information, so that you don't, that if that person is receiving market sounding information, they're not tainting the entire firm from trading in that name, but they're, they keep that information walled off appropriately. So that would also be part of like uplift to the procedures around these handling information. And then review and monitoring controls. So, just now we mentioned that the policies and procedures are one thing that we want to look at and implement. SFC also mentioned that there should be like a robust consequence management framework around this, so that people are aware that if they're not complying with these guidelines, as with any other compliance requirement, what's the consequence management framework in place? And one way to sort of achieve that or look out for that is by having the right monitoring in place. So this would probably typically need periodic reviews, of personal staff personal trading, looking at voice and email communications for any evidence of misuse or leakage of market sounding that may be coming into the firm. Again, this is probably reviews that are already in place, so it may just be a matter of refining those keywords or looking at slightly different information when conducting those reviews. And then there should also be, the firm should also make sure that there's a review or monitoring process in place for employees' unauthorized access to market sounding information. So making sure that people are, again, the information barriers are properly in place and that there's not the leakage of information from one side of the firm, from one side of operations to the other. So these are sort of some of the overarching principles, some of the things that we should keep in mind. And it seems like it will be case by case in terms of the firm's own size, their risk, and what they look like in terms of how to implement and where to think about uplifting policies or adding monitoring or governance framework to make sure that the spirit of the guidelines are captured by the firm and being followed.
Thanks, Laura and Pranavi. That was very detailed, and I didn't want to interrupt you at all going through it because you had a really lovely flow discussing both the MA regime as well as SFC. So in terms of my compliance office and how we assist firms in the inside information and confidential information space, RegTech can really help in terms of your overall bookkeeping and record keeping requirements to ensure that there's adequate audit trail for all of the processes that Laura and Pranavi have just mentioned, both for MA as well as for the SFC. So moving on, just a little bit about MCO. Our overall suite covers areas about the employee, third parties, firm transactions, as well as overall obligations, regulatory change management. In terms of the market sounding management piece, the key modules that are really affected are those that are highlighted here in purple. So Laura just mentioned around uplifting personal trade management policies. It's really important that your system can handle various types of watch lists and restricted lists to identify if somebody on the public side of your team or private side of your team is potentially trading in a security where there might be market sounding information. And so ensuring that the personal trade management system that you have in place can identify a public side or a private side employee, or on the buy side, any of your employees who might be trading ahead of potential public information, or when information before it goes public, is important. And the personal trade management system also links in very well with our insider list management and deal review modules, which are often taken by the sell side, although the buy side also is interested in insider list management solutions as well, for the record keeping of the receipt of inside information that they might have obtained. So between transactions and the wall crossing processes of both your internal staff as well as third parties can be handled within these modules. And then automatically your restricted list and watch list can be updated to ensure that those employees are not trading in that activity and highlighting potential conflicts of interest within those two capabilities. Communication surveillance has already been mentioned as well. Obviously, many firms are using different expert network firms for the record-keeping processes around market-sounding activities, but perhaps do not have a consolidated view of all of those recorded communications. And so the e-communication surveillance capability can be used for the archiving and review of communications within your organization. Again, potential items that might be on your watch list or restricted list because you have market sounding activity going on could be picked up through that communication surveillance profile and sources that you have set up. And lastly, policy content. So we talked a lot about updating your policies as well as your procedures for consent, market sounding activities, both the giving and receiving of that information. Policy content does that, allows you to create your policies, review them, and publish them to your employees, as well as attest to those on a regular basis. So those are key areas that MCO plays with. I just wanted to highlight a couple of things about our inside information module. This really does allow you to record whether it is MNPI or confidential information or inside information, or even the record keeping of information that you might think is sensitive, that you might want to follow these guidelines because it's a bit of the gray area. You're not sure if it is going to be market moving or not. So the way that we can record inside information in MCO allows you to record your permanent insiders, your above the wall groups, as well as your private public siders and external third parties that might have access to the system. You can request those third parties to obtain their consent through a form that you send out to external third parties in the system. And that can also, record the whether they have given you consent or not, or whether they are added to that inside information piece. And also, what type of MPI that is. You'll see that on the MMPI itself, we're able to record what is that type of inside information. Is it highly confidential, or is it MMPI? This is all configurable based on your own policy and record keeping processes for what we call inside information, but can be broader than this for the keeping of confidential information in different record types. For example, in Japan, I know we have very strict types of MMPI that are within the regulation versus, say, the SFC, which might be a little bit broader, versus MA, which is really talking about MMPI itself. And then the reason for that inside information can be recorded, again, configured to your own requirement in terms of what is the information that you're obtaining as part of this market founding activity. This can all trigger different workflows and approval processes for the external third parties that are being wall crossed onto the inside information, or for your receipt of inside information as well. Now, I'll just move on to see if there's any questions that have been put through. Okay, so I do have one question here for Pranavi and Laura. Are there any specific governance or actions that firms can implement to ensure that they'll meet the expectations? Like really specific, practical actions that they could take?
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe I can start on that one. Keeping in mind the 4 core principles that the SFC has defined, that's the spirit that you would be following for your governance models as well. So a few practical things that our clients have brought to us and we just wanted to share here as well is who is receiving that information. A lot of times, disclosing persons are going straight to the CIO, who is the decision maker to give market sounding information and consent for that. And what that happens is if that's the sole decision maker within the market sounding information and within the investment universe of the firm as well, then it is difficult to cordon off that information and still have relevant transactions after receiving that information. So it should ideally be someone on the operations or compliance side. But again, this is very specific to the model that you have and the size of the firm. So I think the first thing that we did, I think is important, is ensuring that you are aware of who is it that is going to give consent for market sounding, and then who receives that information. The person who receives the information, are they aware of the internal policies and procedures? The second is clear and robust information sharing processes like we had shared. Key responsibilities, and then also a robust information sharing. So what are the do's and don'ts to keep in mind, having your policies and the compliance framework built out on that. The third thing I think that is going to be important for this is physical and functional segregation. And then again, this brings out to the first point that I made on who is receiving that information. If it is someone on the investment side, then can you still have legitimate transactions if that is the sole investment decision maker? And finally, if there is a scenario of which you do receive information that you didn't consent on, what are the escalation protocols? What are you going to do in terms of when this information is there? How are you going to note it down? Who should be informed of the information that has been accidentally received? And then what are the mitigation controls that the firm is going to take into consideration? So these are some of the nuances that we could think of as to how you can handle it. Of course, once the sell side comes up with their protocols and requirements of this, then there are more specific guidelines that the buy side can have in terms of their governance models as well.
I think that raises a very good point there around if you do receive this information, this market sounding information that you didn't give consent, how you report that up and obviously keep it sensitive and confidential within your firm and without involving the whole firm. That is a really, really good point. Knowing that at the beginning we had that question around, what is material non-public information versus market sounding info? It sounds like that is becoming the biggest challenge, or one of, it was 18%. Is there any further insights that we can give around the definition of market sounding and what the SFC expects to cover?
Yeah, I can help take this one. So I think the good news is that we're in a lot clearer place than it was initially. I think initially there was a lot more ambiguity and questions around what exactly SFC had in mind when they were thinking about what to include as market sounding and what would be subject to these guidelines. The key now is really, whether it's been confidential information that's been, entrusted to the disclosing person by a market sounding beneficiary. So has there been a specific transaction in mind where the disclosing person is going out into the market to try to gauge investor interest? The SFC does impose a certain onus on the recipient person to also reasonably verify if what they're receiving is market sounding, because although the disclosing person should be upfront and clear about that, there is also the obligation of the recipient to, if they have a feeling that it might be market sounding or that they're concerned it may be, that they should reasonably verify that. So, that may include asking more questions, confirming more questions with the disclosing party at that time. It will be, I think it will have to be situations where, as the SFC is quite clear that those sort of day-to-day working orders, they're not anticipating that is going to be covered by these guidelines. It's more along what I think we had traditionally thought were, sort of those block trades, those sorts of transactions that the person reaching out to the market disclosing party has been really like entrusted with that confidential duty by the issuer, by the person, the market sounding beneficiary. So that's sort of the key point, I think, to look out for.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you very much. So I've certainly noticed the SFC has been putting out a lot of circulars lately around certain enforcement and cases that they're trying to wrap up and close. We have a question, how has the SFC enforced poor practices in this area in recent years? I guess in light of the fact that they've now got new guidance coming out. Are there any key challenges or in avoiding potential lapses or risks of being non-compliant, particularly in receipt of, or misuse of confidential information that they're not aware of, that the compliance team's not aware of?
Sure.
I guess it's, how can we, key challenges in avoiding potential lapses, basically. Things that might just really trip up the SFC if your policies aren't in place.
Yeah, that's actually a really good question, because there are so many scenarios that can stem out of these guidelines on how this is going to be applicable and the interpretation of these guidelines and the broad definition that is there. The good thing is at least we have something by the SFC in the guidelines of which can be followed. A concise answer to this question is having functional segregation, and also the person who is going to get MSI, that person should be knowledgeable enough of the SFC's expectations as well as what the SFC is clearly defining within scope or not. For example, if it is DCM transactions, that are these transactions going to materially affect price of a listed security is going to be an important aspect. A person who's not aware of this caveat, or they might think the DCM is absolutely out of scope and then can allow this. So I think the first aspect of this is going to be having someone knowledgeable who should be approving, receiving MSI. And the second one is going to be the functional segregation to the extent possible for MSI sharing of information and no information to be spilled out within the firm. In terms of has SFC enforced poor practices on this, a lot of times when we see enforcement cases, they have been on the core principles that Laura had discussed at the beginning, where they do see ethics and governance, and even if there were broader aspects. They haven't come about specifically under market sounding, but they have come under governance lapses or lapse of ethical behavior. So that's how the SFC has been enforcing it in recent years, but nothing around MSI. Even in inspections, we haven't seen a lot of focus on MSI yet. But as soon as these guidelines will come into effect, we will see the SFC proactively, monitoring them in inspections as well.
Yeah. So I think we've seen actual insider information cases, but not so much on the market sounding piece before, right? Yeah. Yes. Okay. And so following on from that actually is another question around, practically, should firms just treat MSI like similar to normal wall crossings, given that most firms are not likely to have physical barriers to stop MSI being more widely transferred, particularly on the buy side, smaller firms, etc. So, what should the firms do practically? You think it's just treated as if it's inside information?
Yeah, I think practically it sort of goes back to what Pranavi was saying, that principle about the handling of the information. So meaning if you have the proper information barriers in place so that when the information comes into the firm and it's received by the designated person would be not allowed to trade on that information. But if you're making sure that information is segregated and the information barriers are in place and that there's not leakage of that information, then the rest of the firm should be able to continue its activities. In that case, I guess it would be similar to procedures that some firms probably have in place for wall crossing. It's really going to be making sure that the person receiving that information is properly barriered off so that there's not that sort of transfer of information, which would lead to the rest of the firm being implicated.
That's all the questions that we have today. Firms need to review their policies and procedures, the controls and monitoring that they have in place with regards to this regulation. Obviously, keep a lookout to see if the FFC will delay this at all by the 6 months that Pranavi also mentioned. But either way, starting to put your procedures and policies in place around who is able to receive information, what you're going to do from a record-keeping perspective. And if you're on the sell side, your processes around consent need to be put in place and what that looks like as well. So if you'd like to learn more about My Compliance Office and Kroll, please do scan the QR codes that you see on screen now, and you will find more information about how to work with Pranavi and Laura at Kroll Compliance Consulting across Hong Kong, Singapore, as well as Australia. So thank you very much to Pranavi and Laura and all the effort they put into this presentation today. If you'd like more information about My Compliance Office, please scan the QR code here today or follow up on the emails that we received.